Alara had learned a long time ago that being last in line didn't hurt as much once you stopped expecting anything different. She stood at the far end of the platform, the position reserved for the women nobody wanted to look at too closely, while the auctioneer's voice droned over the heads of the crowd like a fly circling something already dead. Her aunt had picked that spot for her on purpose. Aunt Hetty always said position mattered at these things, that a woman placed first caught the eye before anyone had time to think twice, and a woman placed last had already been talked out of before she'd even opened her mouth. Stand up straight, Hetty had hissed that morning, yanking the laces of Alara's plain gray dress tight enough to bruise. Not that it'll help, nobody buys damaged goods. Alara wasn't damaged, not in any way she could point to. She had 2 working hands, a straight back, all her teeth. But 8 years of being told she was cursed the way only a girl who'd survived a house fire that killed both her parents could be cursed, had a way of settling into a person's bones until even they started to believe it a little. Bad luck walked in front of her wherever she went, Hetty liked to say, loud enough for neighbors to hear. Best not to stand too close. So the whispers followed her onto the platform tonight, the way they followed her everywhere. That's the fire girl, someone murmured near the front. Wouldn't touch her with someone else's coin, another voice added, low and amused. Like cruelty was a joke best shared. The hall of Duskmiri was packed despite the cold, torches guttering along stone walls that had seen 100 years of women auctioned off to men who wanted wives, mistresses, or simply another set of hands to work a household. Alara counted the women ahead of her in line. 9 women who would be bid on, sold, claimed, before anyone even glanced her way at the end. The auctioneer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a voice like a creaking hinge, called the first woman forward. Bidding started low and climbed fast, merchants and lesser lords raising hands, a bloodline recited, a dowry mentioned, and within minutes the first woman was led away by a man twice her age who didn't bother hiding his satisfaction. Alara watched it happen 9 times. 9 women, 9 sales, some quick and businesslike, a few slower, punctuated by murmured commentary about scars or ages or the size of a dowry that made the whole thing feel less like a marriage and more like livestock changing hands at a fair. She kept her eyes on the floor mostly. It was easier that way. Then, halfway through the 6th sale, something shifted in the crowd. A ripple of sudden quiet that moved through the hall like wind through dry grass. Alara looked up to see what had caused it, and found half the room turned toward the great doors, faces pale with something between shock and disbelief. A man had entered, not a merchant, not a minor lord looking to add a 3rd wife to his collection. This man moved like the room belonged to him, tall enough that he had to duck slightly beneath the low arch of the entrance. Dark hair pushed back from a face carved sharp and unforgiving, eyes the color of storm clouds sweeping the platform with an intensity that made even the auctioneer stumble mid-sentence. The Alpha King, someone whispered, and the words spread through the crowd like fire catching dry thatch. Alara's stomach dropped. She had never seen Alpha King Ronan in person, only heard him described in the careful, odd tones people reserved for things too powerful to speak of carelessly. Stories placed him at the northern border putting down a rebellion, or in the capital signing treaties that reshaped half the continent's borders. Nobody placed him at a mating auction in a backwater town like Duskmiri, buying wives like everyone else. Continue, Ronan said, and his voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through silk, cold and absolutely certain. The auctioneer's hands shook visibly as he gestured for the 7th woman to step forward. A heavy-set girl with tired eyes who flinched at the sudden attention. Bidding began, the usual voices calling out modest offers, until Ronan's voice cut through them all. I'll take her. Full dowry. Doubled. She goes free the moment the coin changes hands, with no obligation to me beyond accepting it. Silence crashed over the hall. The seventh woman stared at him, uncomprehending, as murmurs of confusion rippled outward. The auctioneer stammered something about terms and arrangements, and Ronan simply repeated himself, flat and final, until coin was produced and the woman was led away, dazed, clutching a purse heavy enough to change the entire shape of her future. Alara watched, heart hammering for reasons she couldn't fully name, as the eighth woman stepped forward, and Ronan did the exact same thing. Then, the ninth. Each time, the same offer, the same double dowry, the same immediate release from any claim on her at all. By the time only Alara remained on the platform, the hall had gone utterly silent, every eye fixed on the king who had, in the span of less than an hour, purchased and freed 8 women without once explaining why. Last one, the auctioneer said, voice cracking with something like fear now. Your Majesty, this one's considered unlucky. Cursed, the villagers say. I wouldn't recommend continue, Ronan said again, and this time his gray eyes had already found Alara at the far end of the platform, and something in his expression, something sharp and sudden and entirely unreadable, made her knees go weak beneath her plain gray dress. Alara had never in her life had a room full of people look at her like they were waiting for something to happen. She kept her chin up, though her hands trembled at her sides, and forced herself to meet the king's gaze rather than dropping her eyes the way 3 years of Hetty's careful cruelty had trained her to do. Whatever he wanted, whatever strange game he was playing with the auction, she refused to be the one who looked away first. Name, Ronan said, not to the auctioneer, but to her directly, his voice quieter now than it had been for the previous 8 sales, though it still carried easily through the silent hall. Alara, she said, and was surprised her voice came out steady. Something crossed his face at that, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. Alara, he repeated, like he was testing the shape of it against something else entirely, some private memory she couldn't guess at. Your Majesty, the auctioneer began again, clearly hoping to steer things toward some safer conclusion. As I mentioned, this one carries a certain reputation. Bad luck follows her. Her own family says as much. Perhaps one of the other. I wasn't asking for your opinion, Ronan said, without even glancing at the man. I was asking for hers. His eyes hadn't left Alara's face. Do you believe you're cursed? The question startled her enough that the truthful answer came out before she could soften it into something safer. I believe my aunt finds it convenient to say so. A ripple of shocked laughter moved through parts of the crowd, quickly stifled. Ronan's mouth twitched, the barest suggestion of something like approval. I'll take her, he said, turning back to the auctioneer. Same terms as the others. Full dowry, doubled, and she walks free the moment coin changes hands. Alara's chest tightened. Free, she repeated, unable to stop herself. Free to go where? I have nowhere else. My aunt's house is the only roof I've ever known, cursed reputation and all. Something shifted in Ronan's expression at that, a flicker of what might have been surprise, or perhaps something closer to recognition. He crossed the space between them before anyone could object, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. Close enough that she caught the low, steady warmth radiating off him despite the cold stone hall around them. Then you'll come to the castle, he said, quieter now, meant only for her, not as a purchase, as a guest, until we've sorted out something better. I have no intention of leaving you with nowhere to go, Alara. Why? She asked, because the question had been building in her chest since the moment he'd walked through those doors. Why buy every woman here tonight? Why free them all instead of simply taking one home the way everyone else in this hall came to do? Ronan's jaw tightened, and for a moment something colder moved behind his eyes, something that had nothing to do with her, because for the last 6 months, women sold at auctions exactly like this one have been vanishing before they ever reached their new households. Sold twice, once here in the hall for show, and once again in the dark to men who pay considerably more for women nobody will ask questions about afterward. Alara's stomach turned over. Sold twice. There's a name involved, Ronan said. Cassius Vane. He deals in coin, in shipping contracts, in favors owed by men who should know better. I've been trying to catch him at it for months, and tonight I finally had enough certainty to act, even if it meant emptying an entire auction to do it. And me? Alara asked. Was I part of that plan too, or simply the last woman standing when you ran out of others to protect? He was quiet for a long moment. Gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely seen rather than simply looked at. No, he said finally. You weren't part of the plan at all. I came here tonight to disrupt Vane's operation, and I fully expected to leave having done exactly that and nothing more. Then the auctioneer called your name, and something happened that I haven't fully worked out how to explain yet. Try, Alara said, because whatever was happening in this cold stone hall deserved better than half an answer. Ronan reached into a pocket at his belt and withdrew something small, worn smooth by years of handling. A broken half of a carved wooden token. A wolf's head split down the middle by time and use. He held it out, close enough for her to see the details, the fine lines still visible despite the wear. 8 years ago, he said quietly, a girl found me half dead in a forest near a village burned down, not long after, and bandaged wounds she had no reason to trust a stranger enough to touch. She never knew who I was. I never got the chance to properly thank her before circumstances pulled me away. I've carried this half of her token ever since, hoping one day I'd find the other half and finally know her name. Alara's whole body had gone very still, her mind reaching backward through 8 years of grief and fire, and everything that had followed, toward a memory she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it belonged to someone else entirely. I had a token like that, she whispered, before the fire took almost everything else. A wolf's head, split in half, that my father carved for me the summer I turned 9. I lost the other piece the same week our house burned down, along with everyone I loved. The hall around them had gone silent again, though this time the silence felt different, charged with something the crowd could sense even if they didn't understand it. Show me, Ronan said, his voice rough now, stripped of the cold command it had carried moments before. Alara reached beneath the collar of her plain gray dress and drew out a small leather cord, worn thin from years of wear. With half a carved wooden token hanging from it, a wolf's head split cleanly down the middle. She held it out with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, and Ronan pressed his own half against it, and the two pieces fit together as perfectly as if they'd never been broken apart at all, the wolf's face whole again for the first time in 8 years. It's you, he said, quiet wonder replacing every trace of the king's careful control. You're the girl from the forest. Memory came flooding back to Alara all at once, unbidden, a summer afternoon 8 years ago when she'd been gathering herbs near the edge of the woods and found a boy, older than her but still young, bleeding badly from what looked like an animal attack. Half conscious against a fallen tree. She'd bandaged him with strips torn from her own skirt, given him water from her flask, sat with him until his breathing steadied, never once asking who he was or why he'd been alone so deep in the forest. You disappeared, she said slowly. I went back the next day to check on you, and you were simply gone. I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, or that you died somewhere in the trees and I'd never know. My father's guards found me that same night, Ronan said. Dragged me home before I could properly thank the girl who'd saved my life. I was 15. I didn't even know your name, only the shape of your kindness and half a token you'd pressed into my hand before they carried me off. His gray eyes hadn't left her face. I looked for you, after, quietly, whenever duties allowed it. But villages burn, records get lost, and 8 years is a long time to search for a girl whose name you never learned. My village burned the same week, Alara said, something cold settling into her chest as the pieces slid into place with unwelcome clarity. My parents died in that fire. I always thought it was simply bad luck, the kind Hetties spent 8 years reminding me I carry with me everywhere. But if you were attacked by something in those woods that same week, and then my village burned right after, those might not be separate things at all, Ronan finished grimly. I was attacked by wolves that weren't behaving like any wild pack should, driven by something, or someone, into aggression that got me nearly killed. If whoever orchestrated that also had reason to want your village gone, he stopped himself, visibly reeling in a conclusion he wasn't yet ready to speak aloud in a hall full of strangers. "We'll discuss this properly," he said instead, quieter, somewhere with fewer ears listening. "But I need you to know that finding you tonight wasn't chance, or not entirely chance. Some part of me has been searching for this token's other half for 8 years without ever admitting how much I hoped I'd find you attached to it." Alara's throat had gone tight, memory and revelation crashing together faster than she could properly process. "I don't understand any of this. An hour ago I was the last woman on this platform, the one nobody wanted to bid on. Now you're telling me you've been searching for me for 8 years, and that whatever happened to your forest attackers might be tangled up with whatever burned down my entire village. I know it's a great deal to absorb at once," Ronan said, and something in his voice had gone gentle in a way that didn't match the cold, commanding king who'd walked through those doors an hour ago. "You don't have to make sense of all of it tonight. Come to the castle. Rest. Let me look after you properly, the way I should have found a way to do 8 years ago." "And if I say no?" Alara asked, some old, wary part of her still bracing for the cruelty that had followed every kindness in her life so far. "Then I'll see you safely settled somewhere of your own choosing, with coin enough to build whatever life you want. And I'll respect whatever distance you need from me," Ronan said simply. "The offer of the castle isn't a demand, Alara. 8 years of searching taught me that much, at least. I'd rather know you're safe and free than have you close and resentful." She studied him for a long moment, this king who'd bought out an entire auction hall to save strangers from a trafficker, who'd carried half a wooden token for 8 years, hoping to find a girl he'd never properly thanked, who was offering her a choice instead of simply claiming her the way every other man in this hall would have done, without a second thought. "I'll come," she said finally, if only to finally get some answers about why my whole life feels like it's been quietly rearranged by forces I never knew existed until tonight. Something in Ronan's face eased at that, relief bleeding through the careful composure he'd worn since walking through the doors. "Then, let's get you away from this hall," he said, offering his arm, "and somewhere we can actually talk without half of Disc Mary listening in." The ride to the castle took most of the night, and Alara spent much of it staring out the carriage window, trying to reconcile the girl who'd bandaged a stranger's wounds 8 years ago with the woman who now sat across from a king wearing half a wooden token around her neck. "You're quiet," Ronan observed, somewhere past midnight, the carriage rocking gently over a road she'd never traveled before. "I'm trying to decide if I'm dreaming," Alara admitted. "This morning I was mending a torn hem for my aunt, and being told to stand up straight because nobody would look twice at me otherwise. Now, I'm riding toward a castle with the Alpha King, wearing a token I thought I'd lost forever, being told my entire life might have been shaped by whoever attacked you 8 years ago." "For what it's worth," Ronan said, "I don't think anyone looking at you tonight failed to look twice. I certainly didn't." Something warm bloomed in her chest despite the exhaustion and confusion pressing in from every side. "You bought 8 women before me, freed every one of them without asking anything in return. That's not exactly the behavior of a man simply looking for a wife." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't about finding a wife tonight. It was about dismantling Vane's operation before it claimed another woman who'd vanish into whatever network he's built to move them across the border. I'd been planning that disruption for weeks. I hadn't planned on finding you in the middle of it. Tell me about the attack, Alara said. 8 years ago. What actually happened in those woods? Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the carriage window. I'd slipped away from my father's guards that summer, the way boys do when they think themselves old enough to handle a forest alone. Wolves came at me out of nowhere, 3 of them, moving with a coordination wild packs don't usually show. I fought them off as best I could, but not before they'd torn me up badly enough that I nearly didn't make it back out of those trees at all. Coordinated, Alara repeated slowly. Like they'd been sent. That's what I came to believe, eventually, once I was old enough to properly investigate rather than simply accept my father's guard's explanation of a rogue pack. Someone wanted me dead, or at least wanted me removed from where I was that summer, badly enough to drive wolves into an attack that wasn't natural. His jaw tightened. I never found proof of who or why, just enough smoke to be certain there'd been a fire somewhere I couldn't see. And my village burned the same week, Alara said quietly. Everyone always said it was an accident, a cooking fire that spread too fast in dry weather. Nobody ever suggested it might have been connected to anything larger. I don't want to hand you a theory built on nothing more than timing, Ronan said carefully. But I intend to find out, properly, now that I have reason to look at both events as possibly connected, rather than simply tragic coincidence. You deserve to know the truth about what happened to your family, Alara, whatever that truth turns out to be. She studied him in the dim carriage light, this king, who'd spent 8 years quietly searching for a girl whose name he'd never known, who was now offering to reopen a wound she'd spent most of her life trying to convince herself had closed. Why does it matter so much to you? She asked. Finding me, I mean. You're a king. You could have any woman in Caldoria without needing to track down a half-remembered kindness from 8 years ago. Something vulnerable crossed his face, gone quickly, but not quickly enough that she missed it. Because you were the first person in longer than I can remember who helped me without knowing who I was, or what helping me might gain you. Everyone in my life since has wanted something, whether they admitted it or not. Alliance, favor, proximity to power. You gave me water and bandages and sat with me until I stopped shaking, and then you let me go without ever asking my name in return. I didn't think there was anything to gain from it, Alara said honestly. You were hurt. I knew how to help. It never occurred to me to wonder what I might get out of it. I know, Ronan said quietly. That's precisely why it mattered so much. The carriage rounded a final bend, and the castle rose ahead of them in the darkness, towers black against a sky just beginning to gray toward morning, impossibly large in a way that made Alara's chest tighten with something between wonder and fear. Whatever happens from here, Ronan said, watching her take it in, I want you to know you're not obligated to become anything you don't choose to become. Not a queen, not a wife, not anything beyond a woman I owe a debt to and intend to help however you need helping. The rest is entirely your choice, Alara, whenever you're ready to make it. She turned to look at him, this man who'd once been a bleeding boy in a forest and was now a king with an entire castle waiting to receive them, and found herself, despite everything, not entirely opposed to whatever came next. Let's start, she said, with finding out what actually happened to my village 8 years ago. The rest can wait until I've made peace with that much, at least. The castle swallowed her whole, in the way large, unfamiliar places always did. Corridors stretching longer than she'd known corridors could stretch, servants bowing as she passed with expressions curious rather than cruel, so unlike the sidelong glances she'd grown used to in Duskmiri. Ronan installed her in a suite of rooms larger than her aunt's entire house, with a canopied bed and a fire already burning warm against the early morning chill, and left her with a promise to return once he'd summoned someone he trusted to help investigate the old fire records from her village. She slept. Eventually, though fitfully, dreams tangled with fire and forest, and a boy's face she hadn't properly seen in 8 years, now grown into the sharp, storm-eyed man who'd bought out an entire auction hall to save strangers from a trafficker. By the time she woke, sun had climbed well past mid-morning, and a servant arrived with breakfast and news that the king requested her presence in his study whenever she felt rested enough to receive it. She found him bent over a desk covered in old parchment, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept at all. "You look like you've been up all night," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "I have," Ronan admitted. "I sent for the old garrison records from the region near your village. Fire reports, patrol logs, anything from that summer that might connect what happened to you with what happened to me." He slid a weathered document across the desk toward her. "I found something." Alara's hands weren't quite steady as she picked it up. It was a patrol report, faded but legible, noting unusual wolf activity along the border near her village in the weeks before the fire, activity the patrol had dismissed at the time as nothing more than seasonal territorial disputes. "The same pattern," Ronan said quietly. "Wolves behaving strangely, driven into aggression that doesn't match natural pack behavior, in the same region, the same summer, right before your village burned. I don't think it's coincidence anymore, Alara. I think someone orchestrated both events." "Who?" she said. "And why would anyone want to burn down an unremarkable village and nearly kill a 15-year-old prince in the same summer? That's what I intend to find out." Ronan's jaw was tight with barely restrained anger. "There's a name that keeps surfacing in these old records, buried in supply requisitions and land grants from that period. Cassius Vane." Alara's blood went cold. The same man from the auction. The trafficker. The very same. 20 years ago, he was a minor lord petitioning for control over border territories that included your village. My father refused him, citing concerns about his character that turned out, 8 years later, to be entirely justified. Ronan's hands had curled into fists on the desk. If Vane orchestrated an attack meant to kill me and simultaneously burned your village to clear territory he wanted, both events would have served his ambitions perfectly. Removing an heir to weaken the crown's oversight, and destroying a village standing on land he coveted. He's had 8 years to build whatever he wanted on that territory, Alara said slowly. Memory and fury tangling together in her chest. 8 years to profit from my parents' deaths while everyone called it bad luck, called me cursed for surviving it. "I won't let him profit from it any longer," Ronan said, and something in his voice carried the same cold certainty he'd shown the auctioneer the night before. "But I need to move carefully. Vane has connections in the court, favors owed by men who'd protect him if I moved too openly before I have proof solid enough to withstand scrutiny." "What proof would you need?" "Ledgers, testimony. Something that ties him directly to both the attack on me and whatever arrangement destroyed your village, beyond old patrol reports that could be explained away as coincidence by anyone determined to protect him." Ronan met her eyes. "I have people looking. It may take time." Alara set the patrol report down carefully, her mind racing through 8 years of grief that had curdled into something she'd carried as her own personal curse, when the truth apparently had nothing to do with luck at all. "I want to help," she said. "Whatever you're investigating, I have as much reason as anyone to want the truth uncovered, and I refuse to sit in a castle wing being kept safe while you do all the work of finding justice for my own family." Something in Ronan's expression softened, though a flicker of concern remained beneath it. "It could be dangerous. Vane isn't a man who protects his interests gently, and if he learns we're investigating him properly, he'll move to silence whatever threatens him. I've spent 8 years being told I was dangerous simply for surviving, Alara said. I think I can handle a little more danger if it means finally understanding why my whole life was rearranged by a man I've never even met. Ronan studied her for a long moment, something like admiration moving behind his gray eyes. All right, he said finally. We do this together then, but carefully, Alara. I've already lost 8 years not knowing your name. I have no intention of losing you again now that I've finally found you. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm, days spent poring over old records with Ronan's most trusted advisors, evenings spent learning the particular quiet of a castle that had somehow, without her fully noticing when, started to feel less like a strange borrowed place and more like somewhere she might actually belong. Your aunt's been asking about you, General Perrin told her one afternoon, a broad-shouldered man who'd served Ronan's father before him and had taken to Alara with a gruff kind of protectiveness she hadn't expected from a man of his rank. Sent word to the castle steward, wanting to know if there's coin owed her for your, purchase. Alara's jaw tightened. There's no coin owed her. I wasn't hers to sell in the first place. Not really. Just a burden she'd been looking to unload for years. The king's already refused the request, Perrin said. Rather firmly, from what I hear. That evening she found Ronan in his study again, bent over yet another set of records, and something in his posture, tired but determined, made her chest ache in a way she was still getting used to. Perrin told me about my aunt's letter, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Ronan looked up, something careful in his expression. I hope I didn't overstep, refusing on your behalf. If you wanted to send her something, I wouldn't have. I don't want to send her anything, Alara said. Except perhaps the truth about what she's spent 8 years calling my curse, once we've actually found it. She hesitated. Thank you, for refusing. Nobody's ever stood between me and her demands before. Get used to it, Ronan said, something warm threading through his voice despite the exhaustion evident in his face. I intend to keep doing it. Over the following days, the investigation began yielding results neither of them had fully expected. A retired garrison captain, tracked down through old service records, confirmed that Vane had indeed petitioned aggressively for the border territory that included Alara's village, and had reacted with unusual fury when the old king refused him. A merchant with old grudges against Vane's shipping practices came forward with ledgers documenting irregular cargo manifests, shipments that matched, suspiciously, with the timeline of women vanishing from auctions across 3 provinces. It's building, Ronan told her one night, spreading the accumulated evidence across his desk. Not conclusive yet, but building toward something a court would actually have to take seriously. What happens once it is conclusive? Alara asked. Arrest, trial, whatever justice looks like for a man who spent decades profiting from other people's tragedies while wearing the appearance of a respectable lord. Ronan's expression darkened. I want him to answer for all of it, Alara. Not just Vane's more recent trafficking, but whatever role he played in the fire that took your family and the attack that nearly took my life. And if he learns we're close before you're ready to move, then he'll do exactly what men like him always do when cornered, Ronan said grimly. Strike first, and hope the chaos covers his escape. That warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. 3 nights later, Alara woke to the sound of raised voices in the corridor outside her rooms, followed by the unmistakable clash of steel. She was on her feet and reaching for the dagger Ronan had insisted she keep near her bed before she'd fully processed what was happening, heart hammering as she moved toward the door. Ronan burst through it before she could open it herself, already dressed, already armed, tension radiating off him in waves. Vane's men, he said, voice tight. They've breached the eastern wall. He must have learned how close we've gotten. How many? Enough that Perrin's called every guard we have. I need you to stay here, behind locked doors, until this is resolved. His eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten despite the danger pressing in from every side. Please, Alara, I can't fight properly if I'm worried about you being caught in the open corridors. I'm not helpless, she said, gripping the dagger tighter. I know how to use this, and I refuse to sit here wondering if you're alive while I could be doing something useful. I know you're not helpless, Ronan said, something fierce and tender tangled together in his expression. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking you to trust me to handle this, the way I've trusted you these past weeks to handle grief and truth I could barely stand to hand you. Let me do this one thing for you. She hesitated, every instinct screaming against passivity, but something in his voice, raw and honest, made her nod despite herself. Come back, she said. Whatever happens out there, come back to me. Always, he said. And then he was gone, moving down the corridor toward the sound of steel and shouting, leaving her alone with a dagger, a locked door, and a fear more consuming than anything she'd felt since the night her village burned. The waiting was worse than anything Alara had imagined it could be. She pressed her ear against the locked door, straining to hear beyond the muffled sounds of fighting that echoed distantly through the castle's stone corridors, dagger gripped tight enough that her knuckles ached. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, every distant shout sending her heart lurching, every lull in the noise making her wonder if the silence meant victory or something far worse. She had almost convinced herself to abandon Ronan's instructions entirely when a heavy pounding rattled her door, 3 sharp knocks followed by a voice she didn't recognize. My lady. Open up, quickly. The king requires your assistance. Something in the phrasing snagged wrong in her mind, a formality that didn't match the urgency of a genuine emergency, and she stayed frozen, dagger raised, saying nothing. My lady, the voice repeated, harder now, impatience bleeding through the false politeness. There isn't time for hesitation. The king is injured and asking for you specifically. Every instinct screamed against opening that door, and Alara found herself thinking, with sudden cold clarity, of every story she'd ever heard about traps built from exactly this kind of manufactured urgency. If the king needs me, she called back, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. General Perrin can escort me himself. I don't know your voice, and I have no reason to trust a stranger's word over locked doors and Ronan's own instructions. Silence followed, just long enough that she began to hope the ruse had failed, before the door shuddered under a heavy blow that splintered wood near the lock. Alara backed away, heart slamming against her ribs, dagger raised, as the door gave way entirely, and 2 men she'd never seen before stepped through, wearing plain dark clothing rather than any recognizable uniform, expressions cold and businesslike in a way that told her everything about what kind of work they usually did. Vane sends his regards, the taller one said, drawing a blade of his own. Should have stayed at your aunt's house, girl. Would have made all our lives simpler. Come near me and find out how simple that actually is, Alara said, and was startled by how level her own voice sounded despite the terror clawing through her chest. The taller man lunged first, clearly expecting an easy target, and Alara sidestepped with the same instinctive speed she'd once used dodging Hetty's temper, driving her dagger hard into his forearm as he passed. He howled, blade clattering to the floor, and she didn't wait to see how badly she'd hurt him before pivoting toward the second man already closing in from the other side. He was more careful, circling rather than lunging, and Alara backed toward the fireplace, grabbing a heavy iron poker with her free hand the moment it came within reach. Little healer's girl playing soldier, the second man said, almost amused. Vane said you'd be simple, said your aunt swore you were nothing but a scared little she swung the poker before he finished the sentence, catching him hard across the shoulder, and he stumbled back with a curse just as the door burst open again, this time revealing Ronan himself, blood spattered across one sleeve but very much alive, fury written across every line of his face at the sight of the wrecked door and the 2 intruders inside her rooms. He moved faster than she'd ever seen anything move. closing the distance and driving the second man to the floor with brutal efficiency, disarming him in seconds while the first man, still clutching his bleeding arm, made a desperate scramble toward the broken doorway only to find General Perrin already filling it, sword drawn and expression thunderous. "Secure them both," Ronan snapped, and guards moved in quickly, dragging both men away while Ronan turned back to Alara, crossing the room in 3 long strides and pulling her against his chest with a fierceness that knocked the breath from her lungs. "You're hurt," she said, pulling back enough to examine the blood on his sleeve. "Not mine," he said. "Vane's men breached the eastern wall with more force than we expected, but Perrin's guards held them. I came to check on you the moment we'd secured the corridor and found your door already broken." His hands framed her face, gray eyes searching hers with a desperation that matched the fear still hammering through her own chest. "Gods, Alara, if I'd lost you tonight, after finally finding you again you didn't," she said, steadying herself against the solid warmth of him. "I handled it, better than I expected to, honestly." Something between relief and fierce pride broke across his expression. "You fought them off yourself. I told you I wasn't helpless." She managed something close to a laugh, though it came out shaky. "Your aunt's temper prepared me for more than I ever gave her credit for." Ronan pulled her close again, pressing his lips to her forehead with a tenderness that undid something tightly wound in her chest. "Vane just proved how frightened he is of what we've found," he said quietly. "Which means we're close enough now to finally end this properly." The 2 captured men proved more useful than either of them expected, breaking under Perrin's questioning within a single night, desperate to trade information for leniency once they understood how thoroughly their attack had failed. Vane's holed up at his estate near the border, Perrin reported the next morning, spreading a hastily sketched map across Ronan's desk. "The men confirm he's been running the trafficking operation from there for years, using the border crossing as cover for legitimate shipping alongside whatever else he's moving through." "And the fire?" Alara asked, unable to keep the question from her voice. "Did they know anything about that?" Perrin's expression turned grim. "One of them mentioned overhearing Vane brag about it once, years ago, when he was drunk enough to be careless. Said something about clearing troublesome tenants off land he wanted, and about handling a young prince who'd wandered too close to witnessing preparations he shouldn't have seen." Alara's hands curled into fists against the desk. "So it was him. All of it. My parents, my whole village, gone because he wanted land and needed Ronan removed from a position to question how he got it. It appears so," Ronan said quietly, and the fury banked behind his gray eyes matched the cold fire building in Alara's own chest. "Which means we have more than enough now to move against him properly, publicly, in a way that ensures he answers for every part of it rather than simply the trafficking charges alone." "I want to be there," Alara said. "When you confront him, I've spent 8 years believing I was cursed, that bad luck followed me for reasons nobody could explain. I want to look him in the eye and tell him it was never luck at all. It was him." Ronan studied her for a long moment, something protective warring visibly with respect for what she was asking. "It won't be safe. Vane's cornered now, and cornered men do desperate things. I fought off 2 of his hired men in my own bedroom 3 nights ago," Alara said. "I think I can handle standing beside you while you arrest him properly, with an army at your back this time instead of just a dagger and an iron poker." Something in Ronan's expression eased into something close to a smile despite the gravity of the conversation. "All right," he said. "Together then, the way we agreed weeks ago." They rode out 3 days later with a full contingent of the King's Guard, reaching Vane's border estate as dawn broke gray and cold over the surrounding hills. The estate itself looked deceptively ordinary, well-kept gardens, and a handsome stone manor that gave no outward hint of the operation running beneath its respectable surface. Vane himself met them in the courtyard, flanked by a handful of guards who visibly reconsidered their loyalty the moment they saw the full weight of the king's forces arrayed against them. He was older than Alara had pictured, silver-haired and elegantly dressed, with the kind of easy, practiced smile that had probably fooled courts and councils for decades. "Your Majesty," Vane said smoothly, "this is quite the escort for a simple border visit. To what do I owe the honor?" "You know precisely why we're here," Ronan said, voice cold and carrying easily across the courtyard. "Trafficking women through auctions across 3 provinces, shipping manifests that don't match their cargo, and an attack 8 years ago that nearly killed me, followed within the week by the burning of a village that stood on land you wanted for yourself." Vane's smile faltered, just barely, before he recovered it with the practiced ease of a man who'd talked his way out of worse. "Serious accusations, Your Majesty, built on what evidence, precisely?" "Ledgers," Ronan said. "Testimony from your own hired men, currently in custody after attempting to murder this woman in her own bed 3 nights ago. And her." He gestured to Alara, standing tall beside him despite the tremor she couldn't quite banish from her hands. "The last survivor of a village you burned to clear land you'd been refused legally. She's very much alive, Vane, and very much done being called cursed for surviving what you actually did." Vane's eyes finally settled on Alara, recognition and calculation moving visibly across his weathered face. "The fire girl," he said slowly. "I did wonder, occasionally, if anyone had survived." "I survived," Alara said, and her voice came out steadier than she dared hope, carrying clear across the courtyard for every guard and servant present to hear. "I survived losing my parents, my home, everyone I loved, while you profited from it in silence for 8 years. I survived being called cursed by people who never once questioned why bad luck seemed to follow only the family whose land you wanted. And I'm done letting you hide behind that silence any longer." Vane's composure finally cracked at that, the practiced smile sliding into something colder, more desperate. "You have no proof that will hold in any court," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. "A dead village, a childhood attack, coincidences dressed up as conspiracy by a king eager to justify seizing my land. The ledgers say otherwise," Perrin said, stepping forward with the documents they'd gathered over the past weeks. "Shipping manifests that don't match cargo weights. Payments to border guards timed suspiciously close to auction dates across 3 provinces, and 2 men currently in custody who've already confirmed, in detail, exactly how your operation functions. Men who'll say anything to save their own necks," Vane snapped. "Perhaps," Ronan said. "But they won't need to say much more, will they, once the court sees the pattern laid out in full? Land petitions denied by my father, followed within years by convenient tragedies that cleared exactly the territories you wanted. An attack on the heir who might have grown up to keep questioning your ambitions. A village burned the same week, its sole survivor dismissed for years as simply unlucky, when the truth was considerably less mysterious than luck." Vane's guards, sensing which way the confrontation was tilting, had begun exchanging uneasy glances, hands drifting away from weapons rather than toward them. "You won't win this quietly," Vane said, a last desperate edge creeping into his voice. "I have friends in the capital, men who owe me favors, who won't sit idle while you dismantle everything I've built over 20 years. Then, they can explain their own involvement to the same court that hears yours," Ronan said flatly. "I've spent 8 years wondering who wanted me dead in that forest, and this woman has spent 8 years being told her survival was some kind of curse rather than the direct result of your greed. That ends today, Vane, one way or another." For a moment, Vane's eyes flicked toward the estate behind him, some calculation passing behind his gaze that made Alara's stomach tighten with sudden alarm. "He's going to run," she said quietly, just as Vane spun and bolted toward the Manor's side entrance with surprising speed for a man his age. Guards moved instantly, but Vane had clearly planned for exactly this contingency, ducking through a servant's door that led, Alara realized with a jolt of memory, toward stables she could see just visible past the Manor's east wing. "He'll try for a horse," she called out, already moving before she'd fully decided to. The stables. Quickly. Ronan was faster, cutting across the courtyard at a dead run, guards scrambling to follow, while Alara pushed through the chaos toward the stable entrance herself, driven by something fiercer than fear, 8 years of quiet grief finally finding an outlet in motion rather than helplessness. She reached the stable just as Vane wrenched open a stall door, already reaching for a saddle draped over the rail, and without pausing to think through the wisdom of it, Alara grabbed a heavy wooden bucket from beside the door and swung it hard into his shoulder. Vane stumbled, cursing, the saddle clattering to the straw-covered floor, and before he could recover his balance, Ronan was there, driving him bodily against the stall wall with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs entirely. "It's over," Ronan said, pinning Vane's arms with brutal efficiency while Perrin and the guards finally caught up, breathing hard from the sprint across the courtyard. "You should have run the moment you saw the size of the escort I brought, Vane. Would have saved yourself the added indignity of being tackled in your own stables." Vane sagged against the wall, all remaining fight visibly draining out of him as guards moved in to bind his wrists properly. "This isn't finished," he muttered, though the words carried none of their earlier conviction. "It is, actually," Alara said, still catching her breath from the sprint. Bucket still clutched in one hand. "It's been finished since the moment you decided burning my village and attacking a 15-year-old boy were acceptable prices for land you wanted. You just didn't know it yet." Ronan looked at her then, exhaustion and fierce pride, and something warmer than either tangled together in his gray eyes, and despite the blood and dust and lingering adrenaline of the chase, Alara found herself, for the first time in 8 years, feeling something close to peace. Vane's trial was swift, the accumulated evidence overwhelming enough that even the allies he'd counted on in the capital found it politically impossible to defend him once the full scope of his crimes became public knowledge. Alara stood before the court on the second day of proceedings, giving testimony about the fire that had taken her family. About 8 years of being told she carried bad luck for surviving something that had nothing to do with luck at all. Her voice shook at first, memory pulling hard against composure, but she found steadiness the longer she spoke. Drawing strength from Ronan's presence at the back of the chamber, his gray eyes fixed on her with unwavering support throughout. For 8 years, she told the assembled council, "I believed my survival was a curse. I believed the universe had simply decided to mark me as unlucky, and so did everyone around me, including the aunt who raised me on that belief and used it to justify treating me as a burden rather than family." The truth was considerably simpler and considerably uglier. A man wanted land, and he was willing to burn a village and kill children to get it, and it took 8 years and complete chance for anyone to finally connect what happened to me with what happened to a young prince who wandered too close to his ambitions. The council's verdict, when it came, stripped Vane of every title and holding he'd accumulated over decades, sentencing him to imprisonment for the remainder of his life while his estates and shipping operations were seized and redistributed. A portion specifically allocated toward rebuilding the village he'd destroyed and compensating the families of every woman his trafficking network had. Harmed. "It doesn't bring anyone back," Alara said quietly, standing beside Ronan on the castle steps after the verdict was announced, watching autumn leaves scatter across the courtyard below. "My parents are still gone. The 8 years I spent believing myself cursed don't simply undo themselves because the truth finally came out." "No," Ronan agreed, taking her hand gently in his. "But you're not carrying that curse alone anymore. whatever shape grief takes from here. And Ashvale's fate, or Duskmiri's, or whichever village bears the weight of what he did, gets to be rebuilt properly now instead of forgotten as simply bad luck nobody bothered questioning. Duskmiri, Alara corrected softly. That's where I grew up, after. My aunt's village, not my birth village, which was smaller, further north, and never rebuilt at all after the fire. Then we rebuild that one too, Ronan said. Properly this time, with people who remember why it was lost and understand it deserves better than being left as ash and rumor. Alara studied him, this king who'd once been a bleeding boy she'd bandaged without knowing his name, who'd carried half a broken token for 8 years hoping to find her again, who'd bought out an entire auction hall the night they finally met, simply to protect strangers from a trafficker he'd been hunting for months. You didn't have to do any of this, she said. The investigation, the trial, rebuilding villages that have nothing to do with your kingdom's usual concerns. You could have simply arrested Vane for the trafficking and left the rest buried in old records nobody would ever think to question again. I could have, Ronan agreed. But you deserved the truth, Alara, not just about Vane, but about yourself. You were never cursed. You were never unlucky. You were a girl who survived something terrible through no fault of her own, and then spent years being punished for surviving it by people who should have protected you instead. Something in her chest, tight and guarded for 8 long years, finally began to ease at hearing it spoken so plainly, without qualification or doubt. What happens now? She asked. Vane's imprisoned. The truth is public. My village will be rebuilt. Where does that leave us exactly? Ronan turned to face her fully, gray eyes searching her face with the same careful intensity he'd shown that first night on the auction platform, when he'd looked at her like she mattered more than anyone else in that entire cold stone hall. That depends entirely on what you want, he said. I've told you before, and I meant it. You're not obligated to become anything beyond what you choose. But if you'll have me, Alara, I'd like very much to spend considerably more than 8 years finally getting to know the woman behind that half-a-wooden token. Alara laughed, the sound surprising her with how easily it came, warmth spreading through her chest at the earnestness in his expression, so unlike the careful command he'd worn walking into that auction hall weeks ago. You're asking me properly this time, she said. Not buying every bid in the room to make a point. I'd like to think this proposal costs considerably more than coin, Ronan said, something wry pulling at his mouth despite the sincerity underneath it. Though I'll admit the first method worked out reasonably well, all things considered. It did, she agreed, stepping closer. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him, despite the cool autumn air settling over the courtyard. Though I think I'd have found my way to you eventually, token or not. Some things feel less like chance and more like they were always going to happen, however long they took getting there. Is that a yes? Ronan asked, hope threading plainly through his voice now, none of the king's careful composure left to hide behind. It's a yes, Alara said, and meant it more completely than she'd meant almost anything in her entire life. Though I wanted understood, clearly, that I intend to keep swinging buckets at anyone who threatens either of us. Marriage doesn't change that particular skill. Ronan laughed, real and unguarded, pulling her into an embrace that lifted her briefly off her feet despite the dignity such a gesture presumably owed his position. I wouldn't dream of asking you to change it, he said against her hair. It's rather become one of my favorite things about you. The wedding took place the following spring, in the same courtyard where Vane had once tried to flee toward his stables, transformed now with flowering vines and soft draped fabric that softened the stone into something warmer, more welcoming. Alara's village, the one she'd been born in, had been rebuilt over the winter months, families resettled with proper compensation. A small memorial erected for those lost in the fire 8 years before. her parents' names carved among them, alongside a simple inscription about truth finally coming to light. Old Perrin gave a gruff toast at the celebration afterward that made half the assembled guests laugh and the other half wipe unexpected tears, recounting the night the king had emptied an entire mating auction and returned to the castle looking, in the general's own words, more thoroughly undone than he had after any battle in recent memory. "I've fought wars," Perrin said, raising his cup toward the newlyweds, "and negotiated treaties with men who'd sooner see me dead than compromise. None of it prepared me for watching this man pace his study for 3 straight nights, because a healer's girl from Duskmiri had gotten thoroughly under his skin without even trying." Alara caught Ronin's eye across the celebration, warmth and mirth passing between them without need for words, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, about how strange and winding the path had been that led her here, from a burning village to a cruel aunt's household to a cold auction platform where she'd expected nothing but another disappointment. And instead found the boy she'd once bandaged in a forest, grown into a man who'd searched 8 years to find her again. Later that night, once the celebration had finally quieted and the two of them stood alone on a balcony overlooking gardens silvered with moonlight, Ronin reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden token, whole now. The two halves fitted permanently together with fine silver wire that Perrin's own wife had crafted as a wedding gift. "I carried half of this for 8 years," he said, pressing it into her palm, never fully believing I'd find the rest of it, let alone the woman who'd once carried it too. I don't think I properly understood, until tonight, just how much I'd been hoping for exactly this. Alara closed her fingers around the token, whole and solid and finally entirely complete, and looked up at the man who'd once been a bleeding stranger in her forest and was now, impossibly, her husband. "Neither did I," she admitted. "I spent 8 years believing I was simply unlucky, marked by whatever curse Hetty insisted followed me everywhere. I never imagined that curse was actually just grief, waiting patiently for someone to finally help me carry it properly." "You'll never carry it alone again," Ronin said, drawing her close against the cool night air. "Whatever comes next, Alara, we face it together, the way we should have gotten to 8 years ago, if the world had been kinder about letting 2 people find each other sooner. The world got there eventually," she said softly, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. "I think that's worth considerably more than however long it took getting here." Aunt Hetty arrived at the castle gates 3 weeks after the wedding announcement reached Duskmere, uninvited and unannounced, demanding an audience with the new queen in a voice loud enough that the gate guards sent word ahead, rather than risk turning her away and dealing with the scene that would inevitably follow. Alara received her in the smaller of the castle's sitting rooms, Ronan standing quietly by the window rather than at her side, close enough to intervene if needed, but clearly intent on letting her handle this particular reckoning on her own terms. "Well," Hetty said, sweeping into the room with the same brittle confidence she'd always carried, though it faltered slightly at the sight of the guards positioned discreetly near the door. "Look at you, Queen of Caldoria. Who would have thought the cursed girl would land so well after all?" "I was never cursed," Alara said, and the words came easier now than they had on the auction platform months before, worn smooth by repetition and truth both. "You knew that, didn't you? Or at least suspected it. It was simply easier to call me unlucky than to explain why you resented raising your dead sister's daughter." Something flickered across Hetty's face, quick and unwelcome, gone before it could fully settle into anything like remorse. "Your mother's death left me with a mouth to feed and no coin to feed it. I did what I could, considering the circumstances." "You did what was convenient," Alara corrected, and called it circumstance whenever it suited you. "You told the whole village I brought bad luck. You made certain nobody bid on me at that auction, didn't you, spreading those rumors specifically loud enough that the auctioneer felt obligated to repeat them." Hetty's chin lifted, defensive now rather than merely dismissive. "I raised you for 8 years. Fed you, clothed you, Gave you a roof when nobody else would have bothered. I think that's owed some gratitude, whatever unflattering things you've decided to believe about my intentions since marrying yourself a crown. You sold me to a stranger's auction, hoping to finally be rid of a burden, Alara said quietly, and you very nearly succeeded in selling me twice, though I doubt you knew the details of Vane's second market when you took his coin for arranging my placement in that line. The color drained from Hetty's face at that, confirming what Alara had only suspected until this moment, that her aunt's cruelty had run deeper than simple resentment, deep enough to profit quietly from whatever fate awaited a niece she'd never wanted in the first place. I didn't know, Hetty said, though the protest came out thin, unconvincing even to her own ears apparently, given how quickly her gaze dropped to the floor. Vane's men offered good coin for arranging favorable placement. I never asked what favorable meant. Precisely, you never asked, Alara repeated, because asking would have meant admitting you didn't care what happened to me, so long as you were paid for it. She let the silence stretch a moment, watching her aunt's practiced composure crumble further under the weight of truths too long avoided. I'm not here to punish you, Hetty. Ronan's already seen to Vane's punishment, and yours, frankly, seems like it might simply be living with what you've done, unable to hide behind convenient rumors any longer. What do you want from me then? Hetty asked, something almost pleading creeping into her voice now, if not punishment. Nothing, Alara said simply. I don't want anything from you at all. I came into this room today expecting to feel something enormous, years of resentment finally given somewhere to land. But mostly I just feel tired. Hetty, tired of carrying weight that was never mine to carry in the first place. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with hands that had finally, after months, stopped trembling at the thought of this particular confrontation. You can go back to Duskmiri. Nobody's stopping you. I simply won't be sending coin, or letters, or anything else you might have hoped to gain by coming here. Hetty left without another word, escorted out by guards whose expressions suggested they'd heard enough of the conversation to understand exactly why the Queen wanted no further business with the woman who'd raised her. Ronan crossed the room once the door closed, drawing Alara into a careful embrace. You handled that better than I would have managed, in your position, he said quietly. I half expected to intervene the moment she mentioned gratitude. I considered letting you, Alara admitted, some of the tension finally draining from her shoulders now that the confrontation was behind her. But I think I needed to say it myself. Needed her to hear, directly, that I understood exactly what she'd done, without softening it into something more comfortable for either of us. How do you feel? Ronan asked. Alara considered the question seriously, testing the shape of her own feelings the way she might once have tested an unfamiliar herb, cautious and thorough. Lighter, she said finally, like I've set down something I didn't fully realize I was still carrying. The seasons turned, as seasons did, autumn folding into winter and then, eventually, into a spring that brought with it news Alara hadn't quite dared hope for during the difficult months of adjustment to castle life and the enormous weight of a crown she'd never asked for, but had, somehow, grown to wear with increasing ease. She told Ronan in the garden, the same garden where he'd once given her the completed token on their wedding night, watching his careful composure crack entirely into something bright and unguarded the moment the words left her mouth. You're certain? He asked, hands gentle against her shoulders, gray eyes searching her face with a hope so plain it made her chest ache. The healer confirmed it this morning, Alara said, laughing at the disbelief still written across his features. You're going to be a father, Ronan, sometime before winter, if the healer's counting holds true. He kissed her then, slow and thorough, the kind of kiss that spoke more clearly than any declaration could have managed, and when he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, she felt him laugh softly against her skin. 8 years I spent searching for a girl whose name I didn't know, he murmured. I never imagined the search would end in quite this way. A crown, a wife who fights off assassins with buckets, and now, apparently, a child on the way. Regretting the bucket incident yet? Alara asked, threading her fingers through his. Never, Ronan said. I think I fell in love with you a little more that night, actually, watching you handle danger with more courage than half my seasoned guards manage under pressure. Their daughter arrived that autumn, healthy and loud, with her mother's dark hair and her father's storm-gray eyes, and Alara found herself, in the quiet hours of those first exhausted weeks, thinking often about the girl she'd once been, standing last in line at a cold auction hall, believing herself unwanted, unlucky, cursed by forces she couldn't name or fight. That girl could never have imagined this. A castle that felt like home rather than borrowed space. A husband who'd searched 8 years to find her again, and who still looked at her, most mornings, like something worth marveling over. A daughter sleeping soundly in her arms, entirely unaware of how close her mother had once come to being simply another name lost to Vane's quiet cruelty. Another disappearance nobody would have thought twice to question. Sometimes, in the very late hours, when the castle had gone properly quiet, and even Ronan had finally drifted to sleep beside her, Alara took out the wooden token, whole now and gleaming faintly with its silver wire, and turned it over in her fingers, remembering a forest afternoon 8 years gone, a bleeding stranger she'd helped without expectation of anything in return. She had never believed, in all those years of Hetty's careful cruelty and the village's whispered rumors, that kindness given freely could circle back around to find her again, transformed into something as vast and unlikely as love. But it had. Against every expectation the world had tried to teach her, it had. The last woman standing at that auction, the one nobody wanted, had turned out to be the one thing worth buying out an entire hall to find. Years later, when their daughter had grown old enough to ask questions about the small wooden token her mother sometimes wore, Alara told her the whole story, start to finish, without softening the parts that still ached even after so much time had passed. She told her about the forest, about bandaging a stranger's wounds without knowing his name, about the fire that took her parents and the aunt who'd called her cursed for surviving it. She told her about standing last in line at that auction, certain nobody would ever look at her twice, and about a king who'd walked through those doors and bought out every single bid before finally reaching her. "Why did you tell him yes?" their daughter asked one evening, curled against Alara's side by the same hearth where, years before, an entirely different story had quietly begun in a cottage far from this castle. After everything that had happened to you, weren't you scared to trust anyone again? "I was terrified," Alara admitted. "But your father never once asked me to simply trust blindly. He earned it. Slowly, the same way good things usually get earned, through patience and honesty, rather than demands. He showed me, again and again, that kindness could be returned rather than punished, and eventually I believed it enough to let myself want more than simply surviving." "And Aunt Hetty?" her daughter asked, young enough still to say the name without the weight Alara herself carried whenever it surfaced. "Do you ever see her?" "Rarely," Alara said. "She lives quietly now, in Duskmere still, and I've made my peace with letting that be enough. Not every wound needs revenge to heal properly. Sometimes it simply needs distance, and time, and the freedom to stop carrying weight that was never yours in the first place." Their daughter considered this with the particular seriousness of a child working through something larger than her years, then settled more comfortably against Alara's side. "I'm glad the king bought every bid," she said finally, "even though I don't really understand auctions yet." Alara laughed, pressing a kiss to the top of her daughter's dark head. "So am I," she said, "more than I think I've ever properly told him." Ronan, entering the room just in time to catch the tail end of the conversation, raised an eyebrow with the particular fond amusement he still reserved specifically for moments like this one. Telling embarrassing stories about your poor unsuspecting father again? Only the flattering parts, Alara said, holding out a hand for him to join them by the fire. The bit where you emptied an entire auction hall because some part of you already suspected you'd find me at the end of it. I suspected nothing of the sort, Ronan said, settling beside her, their daughter immediately shifting to claim a spot against his shoulder instead. I simply refused to leave a single woman in that hall vulnerable to a trafficker I'd spent months hunting. Finding you was, and I maintain this fully, the single most fortunate accident of my entire life. Accident, Alara repeated, something warm and teasing in her voice. 8 years of carrying half a token doesn't sound like accident to me. Call it what you like, Ronan said, pressing a kiss to her temple with the same tenderness he'd shown her that very first night in the carriage, when neither of them had fully understood yet what their strange, winding story was about to become. I only know I'd search those same 8 years again, gladly, if it meant finding you at the end of it a second time. Outside, autumn wind rattled gently against the castle windows, the same season, Alara often thought, when everything had first begun to change, though the wind carried no threat now, only the ordinary business of leaves turning color and seasons shifting forward the way they always did, patient and inevitable, much like love itself had proven to be, arriving eventually, however long the wait. For anyone willing to keep believing it might. Their daughter grew, as children did, into a young woman with her mother's quiet resilience and her father's steady sense of justice, and long after Alara had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone about the curse she'd never actually carried, she found herself, on quiet evenings, still occasionally turning that small wooden token over in her fingers, remembering a girl who'd once believed herself the last choice anyone would ever make. That girl had been wrong, as it turned out, about nearly everything she'd believed about her own worth. It had simply taken the right person, patient and searching across 8 long years, to finally prove it. And on the nights when old memories still surfaced, uninvited, of a cruel aunt's voice or a cold auction hall's whispered judgments, Alara no longer flinched away from them the way she once had. She let them come, examined them fully, and set them back down again, lighter each time, until eventually even memory itself had learned to soften into something she could hold without it holding her back in return. The curse, whatever anyone had once called it, belonged entirely to the past now, ash scattered long ago on a wind that had carried her, however roundabout the path, straight into the one life she'd never quite dared imagine wanting for herself, and straight into the arms of a man who had never once stopped searching, even when 8 years might easily have taught him to give up hope entirely, and who would go on choosing her, quietly and completely, for every year still ahead of them.